Okay. Welcome to our SEC CFTC Joint Roundtable. My name is Jamie Selway. I'm the SEC Director of the Division of Trading and Markets. Thank you all in the audience for joining us today. Thank you for those who have tuned in virtually. Thank you to Chairman Atkins, Acting Chairman Fam, our commissioners, the good folks on the Crypto Task Force, and my fellow staff in the Division of Trading and Markets for preparing today, which we look forward to will be a wonderful event. The last roundtable held by our agencies was nearly 15 years ago. Then we worked to implement congressional mandates under Dodd-Frank. Now, at the direction of the White House, we come together to collaborate on opportunities to facilitate marketplace innovations and growth. And we start by listening to experienced, expert market participants. We will begin today with remarks from SEC Chairman Atkins. Acting CFTC Chairman Fam and SEC Commissioner Krenshaw will follow. Our first panel will lay the groundwork of historical context for our discussion today. Our second panel will provide perspective from trading platforms, followed by remarks from SEC Commissioner Ueda. Our third panel will provide perspective from market participants, and SEC Commissioner Peirce will make closing remarks. So welcome to the stage, Chairman Atkins. Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you very much, Jamie, and good afternoon, and thank everyone here for joining us either in person or, of course, online. But before I begin, and this will be true for everyone who speaks up here, I have to remind you that the views I express are my own and do not necessarily represent those of the Securities and Exchange Commission or my fellow commissioners. I should also like to thank Acting Chairman Fam, as well as SEC and CFTC staff for organizing this joint roundtable with a little advance notice, and of course, our stellar group of panelists for lending their time and expertise to today's program. Today, I believe, marks a turning point in the history of American financial markets. For too long, the SEC and the CFTC have operated in parallel lanes, too often in conflict with each other, leaving the American public to bear the costs of duplication, delay, and uncertainty. That era is behind us. We are charting a new course, one that will solidify America's position as the world's financial leader. Today, I look forward to hearing from industry leaders on how the two agencies can better coordinate on behalf of the American public. But let me be clear, our focus is on harmonization, not on a merger of the SEC and the CFTC, which would be up to Congress and the President to do. Fanciful talk of reorganizing the government risks distracting us from the monumental opportunity that we have in front of us. What matters is building a framework where our agencies coordinate seamlessly, reduce duplicative regulation, and give markets the clarity that they deserve. The path forward right now is collaboration, not consolidation. I look forward to working with Congress and my counterparts across the administration to ensure that the SEC and the CFTC operate in concert, side by side, hand in glove, so that American innovation and investment can thrive. Unfortunately, decades of regulatory fragmentation have left innovation stranded. Entrepreneurs forced to navigate two often conflicting rule books have taken their ideas overseas. Investors have been saddled with duplicative collateral requirements, locking up capital that otherwise could drive growth. America, the nation that gave the world the deepest, most dynamic markets, has watched innovation migrate abroad as our two agencies protected their turf at the expense of the American investor. This regulatory fragmentation may have been appropriate for a different era, but the complexity of today's financial markets demands a harmonized approach. Congress created the CFTC in 1974, giving it exclusive regulatory jurisdiction over commodity futures. This initiative reflected the realities of that era: distinct markets, separate participants, and clear lines between securities and commodity derivatives. But markets, like rivers, have a way of finding new channels. What were once separate streams have converged into a rushing torrent of innovation that demands a new approach. Today's torrent of financial innovation demands a unified response. We are at a crossroads. If we follow the path of our predecessors, America risks ceding leadership in the next chapter of financial history. Already, novel products have fled the foreign markets. Entrepreneurs have built offshore structures to avoid our fragmented, convoluted system. So this ends now. To achieve this ambitious vision, our two agencies must work in lockstep to transform dual regulation from a source of confusion into a source of strength. Together, we can offer the best of both worlds: the investor protections that have defined U.S. markets, combined with an innovation-friendly approach that will keep us at the frontier of financial technology throughout the 21st century. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed a new day at the SEC and the CFTC. The era of regulatory fragmentation is ending. The age of harmonized, innovation-friendly oversight is here. We stand at an inflection point. The choices that we make in the next few years will determine whether America leads the digital age or whether we watch from the sidelines as others seize the opportunities that we should be creating. And together, our two agencies will ensure that the next chapter of financial innovation is written right here in America. The winds of change are blowing. It's our task to ensure that they carry American leadership forward into new frontiers. From the buttonwood tree under which the New York Stock Exchange was started to the blockchain and beyond. It is our responsibility to ensure that all market participants, whether incumbents or new entrants, who are hungry to innovate are not hindered by unnecessary regulatory hurdles in bringing new products and services to investors in our markets. So I'm very interested in learning from our panelists today. We first will start, as Jamie mentioned, with a discussion of how we got to where we are over the past half century, although I think I'm perhaps the only one who's been around that long in this room. Then we will delve into more specific issues regarding areas of overlapping and sometimes conflicting jurisdictions. Unfortunately, I cannot stay the whole time, but I very much look forward to your input and welcome a continuing dialogue over the months and the years as we work together. So, thank you very much, and let's get to work here and learn something. Thank you very much.
Chairman Fam?
Thank you, Chairman Atkins, and to your staff for hosting the CFTC today. I want to especially thank Ileana, Phil, and Taylor from the SEC and Abigail from the CFTC for all their hard work in planning today's historic event. As you've heard, the first SEC-CFTC joint roundtable since Dodd-Frank, almost 15 years ago. I think you'll agree that that's much too long, because working together is working better. It's a new day, and the turf war is over. Can we take a moment to appreciate how far we've come under this administration? The Commodity Futures Trading Commission and the Securities and Exchange Commission have a long, rich history of collaboration dating way back to the 1981 Shad-Johnson Accord, or as I like to call it, the Johnson-Shad Accord. When I was a law student intern in the Division of Enforcement, I also took GW Law's Regulation of Derivatives class from my professor, former CFTC Chairman Philip McBride Johnson. Yes, that famous Johnson. He also literally wrote the textbook on the CFTC and our jurisdiction. I often say that we have to remember where we came from to appreciate where we are going, and I'm pleased we will begin today with a panel on that shared history. Over the years, our agencies have had many opportunities to work together for our shared market participants and the benefit of our U.S. capital markets that remain the envy of the world. There's no question that because we both oversee related parts of the financial markets, the regulatory lanes for our two agencies aren't always clear or intuitive. At times, this has led to unnecessary friction between the two agencies and avoidable headaches for the market participants who depend on us. The proven way to resolve these issues is to work together. Unfortunately, in recent years, the SEC and the CFTC haven't always answered that call. Shortly after being sworn in as a CFTC Commissioner in 2022, I partnered with SEC Commissioner Hester Peirce in an op-ed calling for greater collaboration among our agencies. We sought joint roundtables like the one we are holding today, or resurrection of the long-dormant CFTC-SEC Joint Advisory Committee on Emerging Regulatory Issues. Unfortunately, our recommendations at that time to collaborate and work together fell on deaf ears. In recent years, the dynamic between our agencies could be described as one of competition rather than collaboration. That is not what this administration wants. It is not what we want. And it is not the best way to serve the American people who rely on us. So I'm pleased that as two agencies, we are once again working together for the mutual benefit of our financial markets. I'm so grateful to have a colleague at the helm of the SEC committed to working in a collaborative manner to ensure we are providing the highest level of service to our markets and to the American people by aligning our regulatory frameworks and requirements wherever possible to eliminate duplicative and unnecessary requirements and burdens and to support responsible innovation. You've already seen our agencies hard at work implementing the recommendations of the President's Working Group on Digital Asset Markets through the SEC's Project Crypto and the CFTC's Crypto Sprint. But why stop there? Improved harmonization between our agencies promises to accelerate efficiencies, foster innovation, remove jurisdictional ambiguities, and enhance market access and options for customers and investors. And that's what today's roundtable is about. Imagine, if you will, that you could start over from a blank sheet of paper, that you could come up with a market structure that works best for liquidity, for capital efficiency, for volume, and for flow. And I hope that that's what we're beginning to work on with today's roundtable. What is the best, most optimized market structure for market participants, for those users that stand most to benefit from them, and most of all, for the investors? Many of the market structure innovations that we will discuss today have been live in CFTC markets for some time. 24/7 trading or extended trading hours, perpetual contracts, prediction markets, and of course, crypto assets. I'm proud of the CFTC's longstanding dual mandate to promote responsible innovation and fair competition, and I commend all the CFTC staff over the decades and CFTC former chairmen and commissioners, many of whom you will hear from today, who have made this our tradition and our pride. Now, because we are talking about crypto assets today, I want to take a moment to dispel some of the FUD that has been raised recently about the CFTC and our operations. Let me share with you some statistics for this year. So from January 20th until September 3rd, the number of commission actions that the CFTC has held, excluding enforcement actions, is 18. 3 of those were rulemaking related, 6 were market oversight and registration matters, and the others were administrative. There were 13 enforcement actions, again, from January 20th to September 3rd. And of course, we had dozens of staff actions under my leadership as acting chairman. Now, since September 4th to the present, we have had 11 commission actions in just a couple weeks. 5 of those were rulemaking related matters, 3 market oversight and registration matters, and the rest administrative. And we have had 14 enforcement actions in just the past couple of weeks, again, under my leadership as acting chairman. Compare that to the 13 that we had from January to September 3rd. So I think you will see that the CFTC is alive and well, and there needs to be no more FUD about what's going on the other side of town. So in conclusion, our financial markets are critical to fueling America's builders, growers, and innovators that drive our economic growth and prosperity. As regulators, we must do all we can to remove unnecessary drag on our markets that impedes our chances of reaching our full economic potential. Simply by working together, we have an opportunity to bring real value to our markets and those they serve. I'm looking forward to today's panels on how we got here and how we can work together to promote platform innovation and improve opportunities for market participants and investors while maintaining safe, reliable, and resilient markets for all market participants. Thank you.
Commissioner Krenshaw?
Good afternoon, and welcome to today's roundtable. This one on regulatory harmonization efforts between the Commission and the CFTC. Harmonization sounds like a laudable objective. This is perhaps unsurprising, since harmony is, by definition, pleasing to the human ear. To the extent that the regulatory regimes of our two agencies could be better harmonized to eliminate unnecessary dissonance, while still adhering to our agency's missions and our governing statutes. Great. But you have all likely heard the oft-repeated three-part mission of the Commission: to protect investors, maintain fair, orderly, and efficient markets, and facilitate capital formation. At the same time, the CFTC has its own mission statement: to promote the integrity, resilience, and vibrancy of the U.S. derivatives markets through sound regulation. When investigating paths forward regarding regulatory harmonization, these respective missions should be our North Star. Without that guidance, efforts to harmonize can all too easily lead us astray. For instance, to illustrate an admittedly extreme example, one way for our agencies to harmonize our approaches would be to eliminate all regulation in our respective markets. That would obviously be absurd. But I fear that less obvious absurdities might creep into our regulatory regimes if harmonization becomes the goal in and of itself. Harmonization should never supplant our agencies' respective missions and the mandates in our respective governing statutes. And it should not be used as a means to elide meaningful differences in our markets that our agencies regulate. With that in mind, I urge you to keep our statutory missions, in particular investor protection, in mind as you consider opportunities for regulatory harmonization between our agencies. Anything less would be a disservice to the markets we regulate and the investors who trust that these markets are safe for them to participate in. Thank you all for taking time to join us today. Look forward to the roundtable, and thank you for staffs for all your hard work putting this on.
So we'll call up our first panel, how we got here. Our moderator will be Chris Giancarlo, former CFTC chairman, now a counsel at Wilkie Farr and Gallagher.
Great. Well, hello, everybody. It's good to be here. In 2017, the incoming Trump 43 administration, concerned about a lack of coordination between the CFTC and the SEC, undertook a thorough synergy analysis of what would be the opportunities and challenges of merging the CFTC and the SEC. And that the results of that analysis were reported in a Treasury report in the second half of 2017. I don't have the citation, but you're welcome to find it. We can perhaps post it later. The results of that analysis was not to merge the agencies. It found that putting the two agencies together would result in savings of, you ready? Less than $9 million. The U.S. government has spent $9 million just since we sat down here at the table. And what would have been the cost of putting the two agencies together was considered not worth the candle. The squeeze was not worth the juice, or the juice was not worth the squeeze, you might say. I remember at the time that this was ongoing, I had a conversation with Commissioner Hester Peirce, then she was not yet on the commission. And I said, what do you think of this idea of merging the two agencies? And in her classic way of being able to express a concept, an idea with a concept, she said, I don't know about merging the agencies, but maybe if they worked in the same building, it would be a good thing. Well, here we are in the same building today, talking about how these agencies can better coordinate their activities for the benefit of markets. And what we're doing, I think quite sensibly, is to begin with a little bit of oversight, because these agencies have been acting in markets for the better part of a decade in the case of the CFTC, but also its predecessor at the Agriculture Department for a long time. And the history of coordination is one that is perhaps filled with moments of real harm to markets that we're going to illustrate. And to do that, we brought together a panel, and gentlemen, with one exception, we're all gray hairs, or in my case, no hairs, which means that we've been around long enough to have a perspective on these things. So with me today are some real champions and leading lights in the field. And to my right, or is at the end of the table, is Ken Benson, President, CEO of SIFMA, representing broker-dealers, investment banks, and asset managers operating in the U.S. and abroad. Craig Lewis, the Madison S. Wigginton Professor of Finance Emeritus at Vanderbilt University's Owen School, Graduate School of Management, former Director of the Division of Economic and Risk Analysis and Chief Economist at the SEC. Scott Litvinoff is the Chief Regulatory and Product Counselor at Interactive Brokers, the publicly traded electronic securities and commodities brokerage firm. Walt Lucan runs the FIA, representing the futures, options, and cleared derivative markets. And prior to the FIA, Walt was both a commissioner and acting chair of the CFTC from 2002 to 2009. And Jim Overdahl, who advises clients in financial markets and the U.S. regulatory environment through the Delta Strategy Group. Jim served 3 years as chief economist for the SEC and 5 years as chief economist for the CFTC. What we're going to try to do is illustrate some of these past examples, but then before we leave, we'll talk about perhaps some ideas that this august group sees for better coordination before the agency. So what I'd like to do is start with Jim, perhaps. Jim, tell us a little bit about some of your experience, and specifically the Shad Johnson agreement that Acting Chair Fam referenced.
Well, thank you. And yes, it's been probably, for me, almost 40 years of working on these issues of SEC, CFTC coordination. So I've seen several efforts over the years to do this. And one that stands out was when I first arrived at the SEC as a staff economist in the 1980s, late 1980s. The issue of the day was program trading and index arbitrage. And the issue was one that emerged because there were differences in the trading structures between the Chicago Mercantile Exchange and the New York Stock Exchange, where open outcry trading at the CME resulted in prices responding very quickly to new information that then spawned index arbitrage order flow through baskets of individual stocks, component stocks of the index that went to the NYSE for execution. And of course, this large volume of one-sided order flow led to some issues at the NYSE where the specialists, and for those of you who are not old enough to remember what a specialist is, they were essentially the market makers at the designated market makers for individual stocks at the NYSE, whose mission was to have prices move continuously without large gaps, and there was a variety of ways in which they were scored, but they were to provide orderly and continuous markets. And this led to this issue of program trading and the index arbitrage that was spawned by it led to a lot of discussion between the SEC and the CFTC that was not very productive. Essentially, the CFTC and SEC had different worldviews about how markets should operate. The SEC or the CFTC viewed, I don't think they even thought there was an issue because the markets were working very well. The futures markets were working very well in responding quickly to new information, efficient price discovery. And this is exactly how markets under their view should work. Whereas at the SEC at that time, they viewed this futures related arbitrage as an instance of the tail wagging the dog. And that was the term that was used at that time, where this order flow was viewed to have caused excessive volatility and led to a lot of discussion, unproductive discussion about volatility and how markets should operate. I remember at the time, volatility, which seemed to be the issue of the day, and people would refer to it as like cholesterol, that there's a good kind and a bad kind. And the CFTC viewed this volatility as a good kind because it was the markets doing their job of responding quickly to new information, whereas the SEC viewed it as the bad kind of cholesterol or bad kind of volatility because it was, in their view, due to it was artificially induced due to differences in market structure. And so the bottom line is, after all this discussion, that the SEC and CFTC could come to agreement on this issue. And the SEC went its own way. It blessed the rules of the NYSE that were put in place to the so-called collars to limit or restrict order entry for index arbitrage order flow, where on days in which there was a 50-point move in the Dow, up or down, that would create these restrictions on how orders were routed to the specialists. And of course, this became something that happened almost every day. It was routine. So you would hear people talk about another day, another collar that happened almost all the time. Now, what were the consequences of this, of the inability of the SEC and CFTC to agree to an approach? We actually looked at it as economists when I was at the SEC, and we found that these restrictions did their job that the NYSE rules intended. They curtailed index arbitrage volume, but they seemed to have very little impact on the market. And the reason was because specialists could look and see what was happening at the CME, and they could incorporate that information in revising their quotes. They didn't want to be caught flat-footed. They didn't want to have stale quotes. So they were updating they didn't wait around for the arbitrager to arrive. That it was done through this informal mechanism of actually looking and seeing what was happening in the market. So I guess where I would conclude on this instance down memory lane is that the consequences of this disagreement, market forces actually carried the day and won out. And in the end, the information still was incorporated in prices in spite of all the fuss and inability to come up with a coordinated solution.
Jim, to what extent was that different view of the role of volatility in markets perhaps due to the different orientation of the two agencies, with the SEC focused perhaps on retail more than wholesale markets, CFTC more focused on wholesale market activity rather than retail?
Well, I think that certainly would be a big part of how their worldview was established, but it also comes from their governing statutes, that the CFTC, as I see it under their statute, is focused on risk management and price discovery, whereas the CFTC, as we heard earlier, capital formation and also fair and orderly markets and investor protection. And probably the fair and orderly markets part of that was what was carrying the day in their view at that time.
Well, one of the issues that's something of a poster child for failure of cooperation between the CFTC and the SEC is a topic known as single stock futures. Perhaps you can explain to the audience what that is, because I'm sure, like some of these other issues, many people weren't around long enough, and then tell us why that was a problem.
Yeah, first off, it feels great to be on a dais at a commission event. It feels like the old days, Chris. I may not leave. So yeah, but thanks for Chair, it's right. Chair Atkins and Acting Chair Fam for organizing this. First off, I'll sort of don't want to bury the lead, but I counted since 2000 how many MOUs on harmonization there's been between the two agencies. There's been 4. I may be missing one somewhere, but there was one in 2004 around single stock futures. I signed one with Chairman Cox in 2008. Chris, you signed one in 2018, and I think the last administration signed one as well. The thing I would say is that MOUs are not enough. I mean, I think what we need to do is find some ways to structure things, to give the political will to move forward on a lot of these important issues where markets, as Chairman Atkins said, are converging like a river, a torrid river. So how do we do that? Well, I do want to talk about Shad Johnson. So the Shad Johnson Accord was, of course, the agreement between John Shad and Philip McBride Johnson in 1981. That was codified into law in 1982. Fast forward, what that did was it allowed broad-based indices, futures on broad-based indices to be under the exclusive jurisdiction of the CFTC, and it banned everything else from narrow to single for the time being. In the meantime, markets do what markets do, and they start to innovate. And then we saw overseas that the London International Financial Futures Exchange, LIFE as it's known, started to list single stock futures, not surprising. The U.S. started to lose productivity and competitiveness. And so Congress decided in the CFMA that we needed to revisit this, and the SEC and the CFTC came back together, and they came up with a structure to do this. I remember I was working in the Senate at the time. We were writing dear colleague letters. The British are coming. It was like the Ryder Cup yesterday. They were eating our lunch, so we got Congress to put into this dual regulatory structure. But it was a dual joint regulatory structure, very prescriptive in order to get the deal done, but it lifted the ban. Good news, right? And so 2 exchanges decided to put forward an effort to list single stock futures, NQLX and one Chicago. Quickly, there became only 1 exchange after the burdensome regulatory environment they faced. Fast forward, I think David Downey, who ran one Chicago for many, many years, I would get a call every couple of years. How can we fix this? The margins I'm facing are different than the margins that either futures products or even equity options products are facing. How do we resolve this? And he kept beating the drum, and we tried and we tried and we tried. Good news is the SEC I think right before the end of the last Trump administration fixed the margin issue. I think they moved it from 20% to 15%. The bad news is one Chicago went out of business a month before that. So it was too little, too late. And so, and again, if you look at where single stock futures are being traded, they're in Singapore, in London, in Germany. These things are happening right now outside of U.S. growth and productivity. So how do we fix that? The other thing I would just mention is not only that, one of the good news products is a lot of these foreign-based indices have been very successful, especially for U.S. pension funds to get exposure to foreign assets. But there is a cliff edge effect if you go from broad-based to narrow. And you're allowed to offer any customer those products when they're broad-based, but when they flip to narrow, they have to be qualified institutional buyers. So that basically causes enormous legal uncertainty for those products, and they can flip back and forth. The Kospi 200, you would think an index with 200 stocks would be broad-based, but because of the weighting aspects of the law, there can be times when those things flip to narrow and broad. And to the credit of the SEC and the CFTC staff, they've tried to figure out how we can transition these things, but there shouldn't be cliff edge effects here. There shouldn't. Look, we as regulators recognize overseas regulators all the time, mutual recognition that they have equivalent or comparable regulatory structures, but we can't seem to, across town, to recognize each other in a way that would allow us to have some seamless transitions when those things happen. So I do think there's ways to structure it moving forward. I can't wait for the dialogue to talk about what those might be.
Thanks, Walt, and we'll certainly get to that. Scott, I know an area of great concern. By the way, I should say you're the one non-gray here at the table. It's good to have you with us.
Oh, thank you. Very estimable group here. I don't know whether I belong in such great company, but I appreciate it.
And you've certainly been concerned with the lack of cross-margining opportunity and so the hindrance to that. Perhaps you can speak a little bit about that.
Sure. Thanks, Chris. And thanks, Walt, actually, for the call out of One Chicago. As a former member of its board, I worked with David Downey extensively, including, sadly, in the winding down of that business. All right, but back to my topic. That regularly affects the services we can offer our customers. I'm not used to doing that. My voice is so loud. The lack of the ability to cross-margin customer securities positions and commodity futures positions where appropriate. Section 713 of Dodd-Frank encourages, if not directs, the two commissions to work together to permit exactly this. Specifically, it creates Section 6DH, of the Commodities Exchange Act, which permits dual registrant broker-dealers and FCMs to carry futures and futures options and any cash or other assets posted as margin for these positions to be carried in a portfolio margin securities account, and directs the CFTC in shall consult, not may language, to work together with the SEC to adopt rules to facilitate this. In fact, FINRA Rule 4210G, which governs portfolio margin on the securities side, contemplates this precise possibility and permits the carrying of, quote, related instruments, meaning index futures and options on those futures, in a security class or product group within a portfolio margin securities account. But the implementing rules of the two commissions never materialized. And we regularly get inquiries from large buy-side institutional clients about whether we can offer them cross-margining of their futures and futures options positions against their securities positions. Of course, if you have a non-customer, works differently. You see people set up these JBO relationships to do this on the prop side, but for customers, you can't do it. Because the implementing rules at the commissions never happened, our answer to them must always be no. So for example, a hedge fund might be short deep in the money XPX calls, but long E-mini S&P futures. But instead of getting reduced margin requirements and acknowledgement of their largely offsetting delta risk on the two sides of that trade, they instead have to carry their margin in gross, as if they're carrying two naked directional positions, one in their securities account and the other in their futures account. This is inefficient for these participants, requires them to waste money that could be deployed elsewhere, and ultimately is a place where right now the two commissions could still collaborate on something that Congress directed them to. Thanks.
Index products. Scott mentioned those. I know that's an issue where with real specificity, you've seen examples where the two agencies not working together has really hindered the development of new products in that asset class.
Chris, I'm going to deflect a little bit here because I think we talk a little bit more about some of the joint rulemaking that I observed while I was at the commission, if that's all right.
Please.
And the reason I want to do this is I want to stress what I believe is the importance of economic analysis in rulemaking, right? I know that Chairman Atkins is a strong proponent of rigorous economic analysis, and I'd like to give maybe an example of where I thought that really was really reflected in the ultimate outcome of one of the rulemakings. And specifically, this took place when I was at the commission, and it related to the Dodd-Frank Act. And one of the rules that I worked on was how you define a major swap market participant and what's a swap dealer. And the reason I want to bring this out is because that was a joint CFTC SEC rulemaking. And the story I'm going to tell you is one where I think Chairman Fam mentioned competition, right, among the agencies. And I believe that that accurately characterized the way the interactions, at least from my perspective, during that period. At the time, Mary Shapiro was the chairman of the SEC and Gary Gensler was the chairman of the CFTC.
And the issue was, how do you determine who should have to register as a major swap market participant and a dealer? And one of the things that my division did, which was the Division of Economic and Risk Analysis, is we had put together some economic analysis, just looking at who held positions, who carried flat books in this market, how large was their actual activity. And we put this analysis together. One of the things that I did when I was there is I had monthly meetings with the various commissioners as well as the chairman. And one of these meetings was with Commissioner Paredes at the time. And I brought my analysis up to Troy's office because honestly, at the time I was brand new and I wasn't really sure what these meetings were going to entail. So I thought I should bring something to talk about. And so I brought this analysis with me and I showed Troy basically this distribution of activity. And he immediately recognized the opportunity to use this analysis to rigorously define the cutoff level, which at that time I think was about $3 billion is what we were deciding to create as a cutoff. And that was because there's a clear demarcation. If you were above that, you were probably a dealer and it was a relatively small number of participants. If you're below that, you didn't really have that much activity. But at the time, these entities were concerned that they were going to be swept up into this regulatory umbrella and have to register. And so that, I believe, Troy then took that to Mary and talked about it, and those thresholds became a big part of that. And the reason that was crucial is because that economic analysis gave the SEC the leverage it needed to really force what I believed was an economically solid quantitative solution to what at that time was simply a problem where people were trying to use ad hoc sort of ways of thinking about it. So I felt that that was a good example of how coordination, while it wasn't something that was, we weren't holding hands at the time, that coordination was really enabled by the strength of an economic analysis.
Ken, we've talked a lot about the agencies and the inability to somehow get things over the line. Is it all on the agencies for the failure in some of these areas, or is there others in the Washington ecosystem that share some of that responsibility?
Yeah, so thank you for that, and thank you for having me on the panel. It is definitely, the agencies have a responsibility, but they don't have the only responsibility here. Congress definitely has a responsibility here, and I had some experience with that in a prior life. In some cases, Congress has been pretty explicit. Walt mentioned the Commodities Futures Modernization Act. I had some experience with that legislation, and that was building on, in close coordination with the agencies, and building on the Shad-Johnson agreement. And then if you go forward and you look at Dodd-Frank, not so much. It was kind of a mixed bag. If you look at Dodd-Frank across the hundreds of rulemakings that were required in Dodd-Frank, just looking at Title VII, for instance, a handful of rules had a mandated joint rulemaking from Congress, and then a number of rules had things like, may coordinate, should consult. But those, in many respects, are kind of meaningless, in my view. That's kind of what the equivalent of what I call report language in a bill, as opposed to statutory language. Now, I'll say at the same time, I, in my prior career, was always opposed to Congress writing, rule-like text explicitly into statute, because, as we all know, it takes Congress forever to go back and change things. But at the same time, while Congress is giving latitude to the regulators, whom they created, I think they have to be very specific and very direct about what they want. So they need to specify. They need to specify joint rulemaking when there's gray areas between the agencies. They need to be clear about giving an allocation of jurisdiction, and avoid mays as opposed to shalls. And the other thing that I would point out is the reason for this coordination, and I'll come back at the end to talk about digital, but the reason for this coordination is very important. If you think about the way the industry looks today, and I'll step back just to add to the experience thing. When I worked on Wall Street in the 1980s, it was a very different industry than it is today. And I look across our members at SIFMA, they're in all kinds of businesses. They're in Walt's businesses. They're in Scott O'Malley, who wasn't not here today's business. The exchanges are different. I see, see the folks from CBOE, CME, and, it used to be the Chicago guys and the New York guys. Now the Chicago guys are in New York. It's just a different thing. And the asset classes have changed, and that's all a positive thing. And so it's important, because our regulatory agencies maybe haven't evolved as much with the structure. And I'm not going to talk about what we're not supposed to talk about. But until you merge the agriculture committees and the banking and financial services committee, things are going to stay pretty much the way they are. And so it's inherent upon Congress to give clear direction to the agencies where they need to coordinate, where they need to work in the gray areas. And it's important to the innovation industry development, because our members, Walt's members, my members, they're dealing with all these regulators. And so this is, in my view, this isn't about less regulation. This is about efficiency and regulation and the development of products. And I just close with, saying, so today, what are we dealing with, right? So now we're dealing with the digital world and how policymakers are going to address the digital world. My own personal view is absolutely policymakers need to do it, and starting with Congress. And I think they're trying to do this in the legislation they're writing, market structure legislation they're trying to do. They need to give clear direction. They need to determine who has jurisdiction for what type of product, how those products are defined, where the agencies have to coordinate, and they should be very explicit in directing the agencies to coordinate on that rulemaking.
And in the past, in the absence of that direction from Congress, what we've had is really episodic periods of coordination and also periods of rivalry and separate lane activities by the two agencies. I'll share my own view from my own time when I was chairman. As we were going through that analysis by the Treasury of the merger, then incoming Chair Clayton and I met up together, and we said, look, I don't know where this analysis is going to go, but we ought to be coordinating anyway. It was toned from the top that we tried to set. And over the next several years, he and I would meet for dinner every 6 to 8 weeks. And we would often find a table in the corner, and I'd pull out an envelope on the back of which I'd written about 5 or 6 issues where my staff was telling me they weren't getting things done because the SEC was standing in the way. And sure enough, Jay would have his own list of 6 or 7 issues where the SEC was saying it was the CFTC that was the problem. And we would go through it, and I'll say, Jay, you take the first 3, I'll take the next 4, you take the next 3. Let's come back in 8 weeks and see what we can get done. And we'd go and we'd meet with the staffs, and they'd have all great reasons. And this is not about a lack of desire by the staff, but they'd have all great reasons why things couldn't get done. And we'd have to assert the authority of the chairman's office to push those things along. I think after about 2.5 years of those 8 weekly dinners, we got probably half those things off the list. It's not easy. And so what I'd like to turn to next as a panel is, how do we take a process that when it works heretofore, it's only worked because you've had chairs and commissioners that want to see coordination, to a process that is maybe more systemic? Is there systematic? Is there a way that we can share some of our decades of experience with the chairs that are here today and the commissioners, that they can maybe turn this into something that's not a couple of dinners every couple of years by chairman, but are actually a process they can do, so that this new day actually extends to tomorrow here at the commission?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I mean, I think what you're talking about is you and Jay were putting political will behind these efforts, right? And in some ways, accountability. I think that's what needs to happen. I mean, putting something on paper every 5 years, an MOU and a desire to work together just isn't enough. And I've seen the energy peters out. I love this joint advisory committee that the agencies had coming out of Dodd-Frank. Again, it's public, it's holds people accountable. It shows political will to staff to make courageous decisions, because I don't blame staff for not wanting to take innovative risks, when your job is to do the mission of your respective agencies. So they have to have the political courage given by the Senate approved, confirmed political position. So I think starting there is there needs to be high level discussions frequently, on a schedule with timetables coming out of them. I think would be a great starting point.
I'm going to come back to you because you kicked this off here. What do you think? How do we turn this into something that's driven not only by the will of the leadership, but actually comes down deeper into the organization?
Yeah, so I agree with them. I agree with what both, excuse me, with both Walt and you said. There's if you go back to Dodd-Frank Title VII, there have been some instances where I think the CFTC obviously was out of the chute really quickly and promulgated a bunch of rules. The SEC's a little bit slower moving along. We would say CFTC probably went a little too fast. The SEC maybe a little too slow. But in some cases, we've seen where while the rules may not be identical, it's almost better to sort of think about, okay, can we just have one rule here? And let's not let perfect be the enemy of the good. Once we've already sort of gotten there, the industry started to develop. And again, these are often the same firms that are having to do it between the FCM and the broker dealer, the bank, wherever. And so I think there's probably some low hanging fruit that the agencies can find where they can collaborate. I would, and you're getting, stakeholders are weighing in here. And so I would take advantage of that. The second would be that, this is, again, I don't want to keep putting pressure on Congress, but I have a lot of respect for the institution, but they have a job to do here as well. They need to go through their oversight function and sort of say, where are you? We wrote this law 15 years ago. Where are you on your implementation? Why is it taking so long? And that's where they can, the whole Senate confirmed they can put some pressure.
Jim, your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I agree with what Ken said, that Congress certainly has a role. And I think that's been, in my experience, where these harmonization efforts in the past have faltered is lack of authority. And it has to be more than good intentions and creating kumbaya moments. It's got to be actual authority to implement whatever is agreed to. And Shad Johnson might be a good example where the two chairmen came together, ironed out an issue, but then Congress confirmed it later and give it that authority. And I was pleased to see in the joint statement of the commissions about this roundtable and about harmonization in general, that there was a lot of thought about using existing authority, exemptive authority, and rulemaking authority, things that are clearly within their ability to create a sustained, permanent solution to an issue. But then the other thing I think I've learned from my experience watching this is that there's a lot of clever people out there in the market that are always going to be looking for ways to innovate around existing barriers, and we should expect that. And we should not expect that anything we do is going to be a permanent solution, that it's going to have to be an ongoing relationship. And I guess the final thing I would say, I think we heard earlier today about put the two agencies in the same building, or at least the same part of town. I think there could be staff interactions, detail assignments, a swap of staff so people can see what the authorities are that in the two agencies, and work, and just more collaboration that way.
Actually, I think you make an excellent point with that. One of the frustrations I had as chair is when I would go to our staff and say, okay, the SEC, we need to resolve this. What's the issue? Our staff would have a really good reason why they disagreed with the SEC. And Clayton would go and tell me that his guys had a really good reason why they disagree. And short of just flipping a coin, I really wanted to get the staffs to work together to see if they could find some common ground. And part of the problem is if you only have the touch points at the commission level and you don't have those touch points deeper down in the staff, if they don't see their peers at the other agency as peers, but they see them as competitors, then it's really hard to get that harmony. It's really hard to get that compromise. Craig, I want to turn to you because you've worked in the belly of the beast. Are there ways that in this new era of cooperation, the staffs can, short of being in the same building or in the same part of town, is there ways that the staffs can come together? And as an economist, I often know, I love economists, but every time I ask one, they have a different view than the other, which is part of the discipline. I get it. But is there a way that staffs can work together and perhaps see how if nothing else, see how the other side sees the world?
So in my experience, the staff views the chairman as their ultimate boss, their director, and then their chairman. They're going to take direction from the top. And so as long as the chairs have mutually agreed, sort of views on how the world should work, that is the way you get the staff to cooperate. As long as they both know they're going to be held accountable to their superiors for what happens, I think it naturally takes care of itself. The one thing that I thought was fairly effective, and Ken had mentioned more congressional oversight. I think identifying issues that are where there's sort of where sort of overlap, bringing the chairman to a hearing and forcing them to talk about what they're doing, why aren't they making progress, what's the timeline. I think those are very effective at motivating the chairs. I don't know about you personally, but I've experienced it and seen it firsthand.
That's a great point. Scott, I want to come to you because even before your work at Interactive Brokers, you've been in the industry, you've represented clients. Is there a role for advisory committees? Is there a role for task forces here to help the harmonization effort? And is there a role perhaps for the industry through those task forces, through those advisory committees, to really bring to the attention of the commissions where the lack of harmonization is interfering with good market health and good market vibrancy?
Task forces that bring in market participants are always helpful. I think it's always good for the commissioners and the staff really to have more direct interaction with market participants who are on the ground, involved in markets on a day-to-day basis. And obviously, there are many members of the staff who may have only ever worked in government, never have worked at market participants, and therefore don't have that same visibility into how things really work that they might have if they had been on both sides of the fence.
Right. Well, we're going to go to our wrap up here. Perhaps I would like to just ask some advice we have commissioners in the audience, we have former commissioners, we have the industry here. Is there some general advice? I'll start with you, Jim, that you could give as this new day dawns between the two agencies.
Start with what you can do. Baby steps might be the way to go to kick things off.
No, I think if these efforts can lead to safe harbors, developing safe harbors that prevent these type of cliff edge effects, expedited approval for common industry initiatives like portfolio margining, for example. We have the Treasury market clearing mandate coming into effect in a few years. It's not economical unless we get portfolio margining for those products. That has to be done. Are there ways to expedite these processes, especially digital assets with digital asset ETFs coming on board? There's going to be more and more cross-margining need going into the future. So expedited approvals there. And I agree with Jim on the cross-training between agencies. Secondments, if send staff over, there's just certain things you don't understand until you're in the building breaking bread with fellow staff members. I think that'd be incredibly helpful.
Scott.
For once, I'll turn on my microphone. Look, I don't have the inside baseball experience of my far more estimable colleagues on this panel who have experience at the senior staff or commissioner level at one or both agencies. So I'll simply say that if you look at the history of financial market failures, so many of them are punctuated by places where, because of lack of cooperation or lack of congressional direction, there was simply no regulation in an area of the markets. And without going through the whole litany of it, Jim talked about Black Monday in 1987. There's the collapse of long-term capital management in 1998, which had, with $5 billion in equity, a nearly $1 trillion swap book because swaps were unregulated and there was no requirement for capital to be held against them. The 2008 financial crisis, obviously, where uncollateralized OTC swap obligations became millstones around some banks' necks. And most recently, in the growth of crypto, where the lack of a sensible plan of federal regulation left market participants faced with regulatory uncertainty on the federal front and a patchwork of state-by-state regulation as a baseline. So in light of that, I think the best thing I can do here is to just encourage the staff and commissioners of both agencies and Congress as well to consider carefully the thoughts shared at the roundtable and to strive to work together productively for the next 4 years and beyond for the benefit of the U.S. markets and the nation's economy as a whole.
Well said, with the exception that the crypto structure worked at the CFTC, but that's a partisan approach.
I agree with that. Thank you.
Greg.
I guess I had to offer some advice. I would say take inventory of the things where you believe there are problems right now, where you could cooperate and move forward. Prioritize those and then start to work on the things that matter the most.
Well said. And Ken?
I agree with everything that's been said. The only other thing I would add is I really would leverage the advisory councils bringing in the industry. I appreciate the fact that sometimes we feel like we're always complaining and we don't like what the rules of proposals that are being put out there. Maybe there's some truth to that. But I think having the back and forth and engagement can be beneficial. It's beneficial to the industry. I think it can be beneficial to the agencies as well, of talking to market participants of how we're dealing with these rules, how these products are being developed, what works and what doesn't work for us. And I think it'll be better informed in the process.
And I want to echo that. I think, as a former chairman, if the industry regularly met with the agencies and said, your lack of cooperation on this issue is harming the market, I think that's a message that needs to be heard and needs to be stated. So I think that would be great. Can I ask you all to please join me in a round of applause for this great panel?